February 14, 1950. In the Kremlin's ornate halls, two men signed a treaty that would reshape the Cold War. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator who had transformed Russia into a superpower, clasped hands with Mao Zedong, who had just unified China under communist rule after decades of civil war. The Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance promised 30 years of cooperation between the world's largest communist powers. It lasted barely a decade. Within 20 years, these allies would aim nuclear weapons at each other. Soviet and Chinese troops would clash in bloody border battles. And caught in the middle of this communist civil war was a small nation fighting for its survival: Vietnam. This is the story of how the greatest alliance in communist history became the greatest rivalry, and how that rivalry transformed the Vietnam War from a struggle for national liberation into a proxy battlefield, where Moscow and Beijing competed for leadership of the communist world, using Vietnamese blood as currency. When Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China on October 1, 1949, the communist world celebrated. After a century of humiliation at Western hands, China had risen again under the red flag. Stalin, initially skeptical of Mao's peasant revolution, welcomed this vast new ally. The relationship began as China was the younger brother, deferential and dependent. The Soviet Union was the model, the first socialist state, the victor over Nazi Germany, the keeper of Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy. China had everything to learn and much to receive. And received it did. Between 1950 and 1960, the Soviet Union poured assistance into China on a staggering scale. Over 10,000 Soviet advisors arrived in China: engineers, scientists, military experts, industrial planners. They brought blueprints for factories, power plants, weapons systems. The Soviets helped China build its first jet fighters, its first tanks, its nuclear program's foundation. Soviet aid financed 156 major industrial projects. Soviet experts trained thousands of Chinese scientists and technicians. Moscow provided the technology and expertise China desperately needed to modernize. In 1950, China was an agricultural nation devastated by war. By 1960, it was an industrial power with nuclear ambitions. But aid came with a price: deference. Stalin expected Mao to follow the Soviet line on all major questions. When North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, Stalin pushed Mao to send Chinese troops when the war turned against the North. Mao complied, though the Korean War cost China hundreds of thousands of casualties and delayed its reconstruction. Still, in those early years, the relationship appeared unbreakable. At Stalin's funeral in 1953, Mao stood beside the coffin, tears streaming down his face. Whether genuine or performed, the gesture symbolized China's position: the grateful student mourning the master.
Then, everything changed. In February 1956, at a closed session of the Soviet Communist Party Congress, Stalin's successor Nikita Khrushchev delivered a secret speech that detonated like a bomb throughout the communist world. For 4 hours, Khrushchev systematically dismantled Stalin's legacy, detailing the purges, the paranoia, the cult of personality, the crimes committed in socialism's name. Khrushchev announced a new path: peaceful coexistence with the West, internal reform, de-Stalinization. The Soviet Union, he declared, would no longer export revolution through force, but through economic competition. Nuclear war was unthinkable. Compromise with capitalism was necessary. For Mao Zedong, this was heresy. Mao had built his own cult of personality modeled on Stalin's. He had consolidated power through ruthless purges. He believed revolutionary violence was not a regrettable necessity, but a purifying force. And most fundamentally, Mao believed the communist world must never compromise with imperialism. It must confront it, challenge it, ultimately destroy it. In private meetings in Moscow, Mao confronted Khrushchev. He mocked the Soviet leader's fear of nuclear war. Mao reportedly told Khrushchev that even if nuclear war killed half of humanity, the remaining half, mostly in the Third World, would build a better world on capitalism's ashes. Khrushchev was horrified. Later writing in his memoirs, Mao seemed to think of people as mere numbers, expendable in pursuit of his goals. The ideological rift had opened. It would only widen. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, an insane attempt to industrialize China overnight through mass mobilization and ideological fervor. Backyard furnaces would produce steel. Collective farms would feed the cities. Willpower would overcome economic reality. Khrushchev watched with growing alarm as the Great Leap Forward produced not prosperity, but catastrophe. Perhaps 30 million Chinese died in the resulting famine. Yet Mao refused to admit failure, instead blaming saboteurs and insufficient revolutionary zeal. Soviet advisors in China reported back to Moscow. Mao was delusional, dangerous, leading China toward disaster. Khrushchev began questioning whether China could be trusted with advanced Soviet technology, particularly nuclear weapons. In June 1959, Khrushchev unilaterally canceled the agreement to provide China with nuclear weapons technology. Soviet nuclear scientists were withdrawn. The message was clear: Moscow no longer trusted Beijing. Mao was enraged. He saw Khrushchev as a coward who feared American power more than he valued communist solidarity. He accused the Soviets of capitulating to imperialism and betraying the revolution. In Chinese propaganda, Khrushchev became the arch-revisionist who was selling out socialism. The breaking point came in 1960. At a communist conference in Bucharest, Romania, Khrushchev and a Chinese delegation led by Peng Zhen engaged in public shouting matches. Khrushchev called Mao an old galosh, a worn-out rubber boot. The Chinese called Khrushchev a traitor to Lenin's legacy.
In July 1960, Khrushchev withdrew all Soviet advisors from China virtually overnight. Over 1,400 experts packed their bags, taking blueprints and technical documents with them. Hundreds of industrial projects ground to a halt. It was an economic divorce, brutal and sudden. The propaganda war escalated to absurd extremes. Soviet publications attacked China's communes, personality cult, and reckless policies. Chinese media responded with screeds against Soviet social imperialism and Khrushchev's betrayal of Marxism-Leninism. Both sides published lengthy theoretical documents, essentially theological disputes about the true path to communism. But beneath the ideological rhetoric lay raw power politics. The Soviet Union and China were competing for leadership of the communist world and influence throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Every revolutionary movement, every newly independent nation, every communist party became a battlefield in this rivalry. And nowhere was this competition more intense, more consequential, and more tragic than in Vietnam. In 1954, Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel, following France's defeat at Dien Bien Phu. The North, led by Ho Chi Minh, became a communist state. The South, backed by the United States, remained non-communist. Ho Chi Minh walked a careful line between Moscow and Beijing, maintaining good relations with both while preserving Vietnamese independence. But as the Sino-Soviet split widened, neutrality became impossible. Both the Soviet Union and China needed to prove they were the true defenders of revolutionary movements. Vietnam became the test case, the place where Moscow and Beijing would demonstrate their commitment to fighting imperialism. The result was a competition that paradoxically strengthened North Vietnam's position. Hanoi learned to play Moscow and Beijing against each other, extracting maximum aid from both while maintaining its autonomy. But this competition also complicated and prolonged the war, turning Vietnam into a proxy battlefield for communist rivalry. Ho Chi Minh understood the game perfectly. The elderly revolutionary had lived in both Moscow and China, spoke Russian and Chinese, understood both communist giants' strengths and insecurities. He needed Soviet military technology, particularly air defense systems and heavy weapons that China could not provide. But he also needed Chinese manpower, logistical support, engineering troops, and the implicit threat that China would intervene if America invaded the North. In 1964, after the Gulf of Tonkin incident triggered American escalation, Hanoi faced a critical decision. Which communist patron should it rely on? The answer was both, but in different ways. From Moscow, North Vietnam received increasingly sophisticated weapons. Soviet surface-to-air missiles, the SA-2 system, arrived in 1965, transforming North Vietnam's air defense and shooting down hundreds of American aircraft. Soviet MiG fighters challenged American air superiority. Soviet anti-aircraft guns ringed Hanoi and Haiphong. Soviet advisors trained North Vietnamese forces in modern warfare tactics. This was technology China simply could not match. The Soviet Union had decades of military-industrial development and battle experience that China lacked. For sophisticated weapon systems, North Vietnam had no choice but to turn to Moscow. But the Soviets came with strings attached. Khrushchev's successors, Brezhnev and Kosygin, wanted to avoid direct confrontation with the United States. They supported Vietnam, but within limits. Soviet aid came with implicit conditions. Don't provoke America into a wider war. Consider negotiations. Show restraint. Moscow also used aid as leverage to keep North Vietnam from tilting too far toward Beijing. When North Vietnamese leaders visited China too often or praised Mao too enthusiastically, Soviet aid shipments mysteriously slowed. When Hanoi sided with Moscow in Sino-Soviet polemics, the weapons flowed more freely. China, meanwhile, provided different but equally crucial support. Between 1965 and 1970, China sent over 320,000 troops to North Vietnam. Not combat soldiers, but engineering units, anti-aircraft crews, railroad workers, and logistical personnel. These troops freed North Vietnamese soldiers for combat by handling rear area duties. Chinese troops repaired bomb damage to roads, railways, and bridges, often while American planes circled overhead. They operated anti-aircraft batteries protecting supply lines. They built roads, constructed facilities, maintained supply routes. Chinese soldiers died in American bombing raids, though these deaths were kept secret for decades. China also provided massive amounts of small arms, ammunition, rice, and basic supplies. What China lacked in technological sophistication, it compensated for with volume and proximity. Chinese aid could reach Vietnam overland quickly, while Soviet aid had to travel thousands of miles by sea or through hostile territory. But Chinese aid also came with expectations. Mao wanted North Vietnam to adopt revolutionary strategies, protracted people's war, self-reliance, rejection of compromise with imperialism. Chinese advisors pushed for more aggressive tactics and criticized any hint of negotiation with the Americans. Beijing was particularly concerned that North Vietnam might accept a diplomatic settlement brokered by Moscow that would enhance Soviet influence while marginalizing China. Chinese propaganda constantly warned Hanoi about Soviet betrayal, citing Moscow's willingness to pursue détente with Washington. The competition created bizarre situations. Soviet and Chinese aid shipments to Vietnam had to pass through each other's territory. Soviet trains crossed China. Chinese supplies transited Soviet rail lines. Both sides periodically delayed the other's shipments, using aid as a bargaining chip. In 1966, during China's Cultural Revolution, Red Guards in Chinese border towns delayed Soviet weapons bound for Vietnam, denouncing them as revisionist trash. Soviet officials complained that Chinese authorities were sabotaging aid to Vietnam to score ideological points against Moscow. Meanwhile, Chinese officials accused the Soviets of shipping inferior weapons or withholding advanced technology to keep Vietnam dependent. Each side suspected the other of using Vietnam not to defeat American imperialism, but to compete for influence in Southeast Asia. The split had profound effects on how the war was fought. North Vietnamese strategy reflected this dual patronage. They used Soviet weapons in conventional operations, anti-aircraft defenses, tank units, artillery, while employing Maoist guerrilla tactics in the south. This hybrid approach was actually effective, but it also created tensions within the North Vietnamese leadership. Some leaders favored the Soviet model: build conventional forces, accept Soviet advice, negotiate when appropriate. Others preferred the Chinese path: people's war, revolutionary purity, no compromise. Le Duan, who became the dominant figure after Ho Chi Minh's death in 1969, generally tilted toward the Soviet Union. He valued Soviet military technology and believed conventional forces were necessary to defeat South Vietnam and American forces. But he carefully maintained ties with Beijing, knowing that alienating Beijing could be catastrophic. The Sino-Soviet split also affected the timing of the war's major offensives. The 1968 Tet Offensive was launched partly because North Vietnam needed to demonstrate revolutionary momentum and commitment to satisfy both patrons while proving Hanoi's independence. The offensive failed militarily, but succeeded politically.
By the late 1960s, the Sino-Soviet split had evolved from ideological dispute into military confrontation. In 1969, Chinese and Soviet troops clashed on the Ussuri River border, killing dozens on both sides. Nuclear war between the communist giants seemed possible. Both nations massed troops along their shared border, the longest militarized frontier on Earth. For North Vietnam, this was catastrophic. Its two patrons now threatened to destroy each other. Aid from both became increasingly unreliable as Moscow and Beijing devoted resources to their mutual confrontation. Soviet weapons shipments were delayed as trains were diverted to reinforce the Chinese border. Chinese engineering troops in Vietnam were recalled to counter the Soviet threat. Then came the ultimate betrayal from Hanoi's perspective. Both Moscow and Beijing began pursuing détente with Washington. In 1972, President Richard Nixon made historic visits to both Beijing and Moscow. In Beijing, Nixon and Mao toasted each other while discussing how to contain Soviet power. In Moscow, Nixon and Brezhnev signed arms control treaties while discussing how to manage China's rise. The world's most capitalist nation and the world's two largest communist nations were realigning against each other.
North Vietnam watched in horror and fury as its patrons courted its enemy. During Nixon's Beijing visit, the Vietnam War was barely discussed. Mao was more interested in Soviet threats than Vietnamese struggles. Chinese officials assured Nixon that China would not interfere with American military operations in Vietnam as long as American ground forces did not invade the North. This was a stunning reversal. Just years earlier, China had declared Vietnam its lips. If the lips are gone, the teeth will be cold. Now Chinese leaders were essentially giving America permission to bomb Vietnam, as long as it served China's larger strategic interests. The Soviet Union's betrayal was different, but equally stinging. While Moscow continued providing military aid to Hanoi, Soviet leaders pressed North Vietnam to accept a negotiated settlement. Brezhnev wanted to preserve détente with Washington, which meant Vietnam's war had to end, with or without victory. During Nixon's Moscow visit in May 1972, as American bombs pulverized North Vietnam in Operation Linebacker, Soviet leaders entertained Nixon with state dinners and ballet performances. Lea Dan, visiting Moscow to plead for stronger support, was kept waiting and lectured about the need for diplomatic flexibility. The message was clear. Vietnam's war was no longer Moscow's or Chinese priority. Both communist giants had decided that managing their relationship with the United States was more important than supporting their Vietnamese comrades.
The Sino-Soviet split transformed the Vietnam War in profound ways. It ensured that North Vietnam received massive military aid from both communist powers, far more than it might have received from a united communist bloc. In this sense, the split helped North Vietnam survive and ultimately prevail. But the competition also prolonged the war and increased its casualties. Neither Moscow nor Beijing could allow Vietnam to fall without losing face in the communist world. This meant both continued supporting Hanoi even when victory seemed distant, encouraging North Vietnam to continue fighting rather than negotiate. The split also limited how decisively either the Soviet Union or China could support Vietnam. Neither wanted to provoke American escalation that might benefit the other. Neither trusted the other enough to coordinate strategy effectively. The result was duplicated effort, wasted resources, and conflicting advice that complicated North Vietnamese decision-making. Most tragically, when North Vietnam needed its patrons most, when American bombs rained down in 1972, when peace negotiations reached critical moments, both Moscow and Beijing prioritized their relationships with Washington over their commitment to Vietnamese victory.
When North Vietnam finally achieved victory in April 1975, capturing Saigon and reunifying the country, both the Soviet Union and China claimed credit. Moscow pointed to the Soviet weapons that had equipped North Vietnam's final offensive. Beijing highlighted the years of Chinese support that had enabled North Vietnam to endure. But the Vietnamese knew the truth. They had won despite, not because of, the Sino-Soviet split. They had won by playing Moscow and Beijing against each other, by accepting aid from both while maintaining their independence, by refusing to become anyone's satellite. The war had cost Vietnam over 1 million dead and a country devastated by bombing and defoliation. And within years of victory, Vietnam would face a new conflict, a brief but brutal war with China in 1979, when Deng Xiaoping invaded Vietnam to teach it a lesson for allying with the Soviet Union and invading Chinese-backed Cambodia. The Sino-Soviet split, which had once ensured Vietnam received aid from both communist giants, now ensured it would face enemies on all sides. The communist world that had supposedly stood in solidarity had fragmented into hostile camps, and Vietnam, having defeated the American empire, now had to defend itself against its former Chinese ally. The Sino-Soviet split revealed an uncomfortable truth about ideology and power. The communist world, supposedly united by shared belief in Marx and Lenin, by common opposition to capitalism and imperialism, by international solidarity, this world tore itself apart over nationalism, pride, and geopolitical competition. Moscow and Beijing each claimed to represent true communism, while treating the other as a betrayer. Each used Vietnam not as a cause to support, but as a pawn in their larger game. And Vietnam, fighting for its survival and independence, had to navigate between these rival giants while pursuing its own national interests. In the end, the Sino-Soviet split did not prevent North Vietnam from winning the war, but it shaped how that war was fought, how long it lasted, and how many died. It turned a struggle for national liberation into a proxy battlefield for communist rivals who were often more interested in undermining each other than in supporting their Vietnamese comrades. The split also foreshadowed the communist world's eventual collapse, an ideology that could not hold together its two largest adherents, that could drive them to the brink of nuclear war, that subordinated revolutionary solidarity to national interest. Such an ideology was already dying. Vietnam won its war and unified its nation, but the victory was achieved not because the communist world stood united, but because Vietnam learned to survive in a world where its supposed allies were often its greatest impediment. This is the story of the Sino-Soviet split and the Vietnam War. It is a story not of solidarity, but of rivalry, not of communist brotherhood, but of nationalist competition, not of ideology triumphing over power, but of power masquerading as ideology. And it is a reminder that in international politics there are no permanent friends or permanent enemies, only permanent interests.